Today, we are diving into a really powerful story from Mozambique. It's a story that gets right to the heart of how huge political forces, we're talking colonialism, we're talking war, how they actually shape individual lives. And maybe more importantly, how individuals find ways to push back, to resist, and to survive. We're going to see all of this through the deeply personal history of Professor Alcinda Hanwana and her family.
Professor Hanawana kicks off her story with this exact idea, and it's really the central thread we're going to follow today. Those unexpected, sometimes brutal, but also sometimes inspiring ways that a person's identity gets hammered out at the crossroads of their culture and the politics of their time.
So we're basically going on a journey through three different eras. First, the colonial struggle for identity. Then, the absolutely harrowing experience of the Civil War. And finally, we'll look at the challenges facing Mozambique's young people today. All right, let's get into it.
So, our story doesn't actually begin with Professor Hanawana herself. It starts with her grandfather, and a single decision that would just ripple down through the generations, the changing of his name. You know, this one act tells you almost everything you need to know about the world he was born into. This is him, Musagi Malema. He was a Makwa and a Muslim. But see, in the Portuguese colony of Mozambique, there was only one path to an education, and that was through Christian mission schools. And what was the price of admission? Well, he had to convert, he had to be baptized, and he had to take on a brand new Christian name.
And just like that, the boy born Musagi Malema became Jose Manuel, named after the very priest who baptized him. And he was smart. He excelled, finishing the 4th grade, which, get this, was the highest level a native Mozambican could even hope to reach back then. He learned a trade, typesetting, and eventually he achieved this very special, very complicated status. He became an assimilado.
Okay, so this status, this word assimilado, it is absolutely crucial to understanding how the colonial system worked. See, this wasn't about creating equality. Oh no, it was about creating a new social category, a person living between two completely different worlds.
So what was an assimilado? Well, you can think of it as a form of citizenship, but a lesser one. It basically created a 3-tiered system. At the very top, you had the Portuguese citizens. Way down at the bottom, you had the vast majority of Africans, who were just labeled indigenous, or natives. And then, stuck right in the middle, you had this small, assimilated class.
And to become an assimilado, well, it wasn't as simple as filling out a form. The requirements demanded a complete cultural makeover. You had to speak fluent Portuguese, you had to adopt their customs, you had to be a Christian, and you had to publicly renounce any traditional beliefs. It was, for all intents and purposes, a policy of cultural erasure. Now, what's so cool about this slide is that it shows you the actual source for this history. You can see right here where Professor Hanawana explains that this process, as messed up as it was, also had this paradoxical effect. It created a class of intellectuals who would eventually start to challenge the very system that made them.
And this right here is the key takeaway. The assimilado was stuck. They were caught in the middle. They weren't seen as fully Portuguese, but they sure weren't seen as indigenous anymore either. They were living in this social and psychological limbo, not really belonging to either world.
So how in the world did Jose Manuel deal with this? Well, he used something Professor Hanawana calls tactical agency, what one philosopher famously called the art of the weak. It's basically about using the master's tools against him, right? You play by the rules of the system they forced on you, but you do it to find space for your own goals. So Jose Manuel, he played the game. But he also used his job as a typesetter to secretly write for anti-colonial newspapers, a quiet but incredibly powerful act of defiance.
Okay, let's shift gears now and move to the next chapter of Mozambique's history. Decades later, the country is independent, but it's thrown into a brutal civil war. And to really understand the impact of this time, we're going to zoom in on the deeply personal and, frankly, harrowing story of a boy named Marula.
Now, this wasn't random. It was a cold, calculated, systematic unmaking of a child's identity. At just 10 years old, Marula was kidnapped, torn away from his family, and forced into military training. And then came the final step in his unmaking, the ultimate brutalization. After he tried to escape, he was given this horrifying choice: kill his own father or be killed himself. He was forced to kill his own father.
This just lays out the impossible paradox of being a child soldier. On the one hand, they are absolutely victims. They're kidnapped, they're terrorized, they're coerced. But on the other hand, they become perpetrators, forced to commit unspeakable acts. They're trapped in this moral twilight zone, not innocent children anymore, but not fully responsible adults either.
But even inside this absolute horror, you still see these little glimmers of agency.
I mean, think about it. This young boy, in the middle of being kidnapped, had the presence of mind to give a fake name. It's a tiny act of resistance, but it was all about protecting his family. And their humanity was never completely wiped out. This quote just hits you, right? It shows the constant fear, but also that unbreakable connection to family. That silent prayer tells you everything. The child was still in there, somewhere, buried underneath a soldier.
And here it is again. Remember that tactical agency we talked about with José Manuel? Here it is in the middle of a war zone. When the commander, the authority figure, wasn't looking, this soldier would manipulate the situation to show mercy. It's another perfect example of the art of the weak, finding just a little sliver of power in a totally powerless situation.
So, when the war finally ends, how does a society even begin to heal from wounds this deep? I mean, how does someone like Marula, who killed his own father, ever go home again? The answer, it turns out, lies in these incredible community rituals of reconciliation.
This is really the central question, isn't it? And it's not just about one person's trauma, it's about the survival of the entire community. When the big, state-led programs don't exist or don't reach you, people turn to their own cultural traditions to find a way forward.
And the foundation for these rituals is this concept called social pollution. The core belief is that people who have been in contact with death, who have killed or even just seen death, are spiritually contaminated. It's believed they carry the wandering spirits of the unburied, and that this pollution can actually infect the whole community if it's not cleansed.
So the cleansing itself is this deeply symbolic process. First, the ex-soldier is separated from everyone. His old life, represented by his clothes and a temporary hut, is literally burned to ash. Then, his body is purified, inside and out. And only then, once he's clean from the war, is he welcomed back with a shared meal that includes both the living family and the spirits of the ancestors.
And all of this brings us to today and to a new set of challenges that are the direct inheritance of this entire history. The legacy of colonialism and war has created a whole generation that's often left disconnected and without opportunities.
This term, lumpen youth, is used to describe this generation. Think about it. The forced migrations from colonialism and the trauma of civil war completely shattered traditional social structures. This created the perfect storm, leaving so many young people stranded between the rural world their parents knew and a modern city that has no real place for them.
And so we end with this incredibly powerful quote from Frantz Fanon. From José Manuel using the colonial system against itself, to child soldiers finding ways to show mercy in the middle of a war, we've seen generations fighting to define themselves. The critical question now is, what will be the mission for this new generation? How will they find and use their own agency to build a future? That is their story to write.